What is freedom? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is freedom? So, standard definition of freedom is being free from restraints and constraints. That's basically it. It also says being not in prison. So, standard definition, okay? Um, so, freedom. It's a word that basically everybody cherishes it. It means a lot of different things to a lot of people. But philosophically, starting with the basic definition of just not being in prison or being free from restraints or constraints, we'll start there. So, base level of freedom is just not being a prisoner. Now, a lot of people think freedom is the ability to wander, the ability to ponder, to have sort of uninhibited actions or force of will or other sort of physical exercises of sort of proving to themselves that there's no limitations on what they can do. Like, to a lot of people, that's what freedom is. Because you can think and act and do whatever you feel like, essentially without any sort of outside force stopping you or preventing you in the first place from doing anything that you want. Now, interesting question is, okay, let's say in terms of freedom being just not being a prisoner, is freedom present in somebody who doesn't know, who is unaware that they are without restraint or constraint? I'd say yes. I'd say even if that person hasn't done a conscious examination of their level of freedom, that they are, whether they know it or not. And then there's another interesting case, because if we say, does freedom, so freedom we can say is a state. Based on that, it's not a mental state, because freedom is a physiological state, essentially, right? Because if now we can say that freedom is a condition that a being is in, regardless of their awareness of it. So a being can be in a state of freedom and not know it, because it has no constraints, no restraints, whatever. It's just free. It's just engaged in freedom. And conversely, a being can think, they can examine their life and they can think that they're in a state of freedom when perhaps they're in a, philosophically, for this, let's say they're in a state of manipulated non-freedom, but the information available to them that they can examine would suggest to them that they are in fact in a state of freedom, but that information has been given to them by sources that are manipulating them in that manner to trick them into thinking that they're in a state of freedom when in fact they're not. So in that case, where the person actually is not free, but they've attempted to examine for themselves whether they are free, and their analysis has told them that they are in a state of freedom when in fact they are not, is interesting, because the state of freedom is not dependent upon the awareness of the freedom. As a matter of fact, the conscious awareness of the situation can, and throughout historical documentation has been manipulated to actually make the being who's not free believe that they are in a state of freedom, as opposed to an individual who is living an unexamined or unconscious existence can be actually in a state of freedom and have no understanding of it, but they're still free. Even if this person in the first example, even if they were in a state of freedom and they thought that they weren't for whatever reason, that they had consciously convinced themselves that they were not in a state of freedom, they would still actually be in a state of freedom. Now, their mental analysis and awareness may have caused them to essentially mentally cripple themselves, a sort of psychosomatic reductions of their freedoms. They've reduced themselves. They've manifested in themselves through their own power of their own mind, putting themselves into a state where they don't believe that they are free, even though they are free. And so it'll appear very real to them that they are not free, but when in fact they are actually existing in a state of freedom. As opposed to the other example, where the person who's also in this situation been manipulated into psychosomatically believing that they are in fact free when they're in a state of non-freedom. And that effect is achieved by a variety of means, which, that's usually the subject of most dystopian novels, is a rational explanation of how outside forces could convince you that you're free when you're not free, as opposed to this other person who actually is free, but they're convincing themselves that they're not, just through, for whatever reason, power of their own mind, right? So I contrast those just to say that it's clear that the state of the freedom is not dependent on the awareness of the individual as to what they have analyzed their state of being to be. Because it can be analyzed correctly or incorrectly through a variety of means. Now, it's perfectly acceptable, it's perfectly normal for a person who is in a state of freedom to correctly analyze it and say, okay, I recognize that I am in a state of freedom, free from constraint, free from restraint, not a prisoner. They're in a state of freedom and they know it. And that's holistic. And it's also the case where a person can know that they're not in a state of freedom and they're aware of it and they know why, or they know the factors involved, or they know what the limitations are that confirm that they are in fact not in a state of freedom. So we can have all the cases. But that being said, in terms of philosophically, when we're deciding freedom, it's a state that can be assessed independent of the subjects in it, because we're simply analyzing the situation for the freedom of movement, freedom of activities, and I guess in this case we would say there's no intent to restrict the activities or behaviors or thought patterns of the being in question. Because the removal of freedom, I think philosophically implies there's some intention, external intention, to prohibit it. And that contrasts to the case with the person who's doing it to themselves, because crippling themselves does not change the actual state of their freedom. They're just inhibiting themselves. But having an external force work to intentionally, with the intent of restricting your freedom, that can affect you to be in a state of non-freedom. That being said, if you take a person, a being, and you put them in nature before any, no human constructs on them, you just put them in nature, they're naturally in a state of freedom. It appears that a state of non-freedom is directly attributable to other beings intentionally taking action to deprive one of one's freedom. So in that sense, in the determination of freedom in general, it appears that it is an original independent state for all beings. Because it would appear that in order to go from a state of freedom to a state of non-freedom, then an outside force has to act on the being with intention to, in some capacity, affect that core value of the freedom that's in that field, that's present in that field. So the baseline state is freedom. Now this connects to the video about what are human rights. Because at this point, if we're determining that the natural state of being is freedom, then that would be the natural state from which rights are derived. Because if the natural state and the natural law begins with being born in a state of freedom, being born free, then of course it would be that being's natural right for that inertia to continue to, in that case, be free. And that would be the nucleus, that would be the genesis of all human rights, would be understanding that the fundamental organic state of being is freedom, and that external forces have to be applied to alter that state of freedom. And freedom, obviously, at that baseline, sets the circumstances for the much larger philosophical questions regarding free will, which I'll get into in a different video. But freedom, it's a state that we're naturally born into. It's a state free from restraint or constraint, of not being a prisoner. In my analysis, it's the basis for human rights. So what is freedom? It's your natural state. I hope you have a good day. Enjoy all your freedom.